The blood on Ji-Hoon's shirt was dry by the time he reached the airport. He had changed his jacket in the car, black for black, same cut, different story. But the shirt underneath still carried the ghost of what had happened in the penthouse on the 43rd floor of the Park Hyatt Seoul. And as he moved through Incheon International Airport's private terminal at 11:47 p.m., flanked by Ryu on his left, and the man everyone called Ghost on his right, Ji-Hoon Park kept his eyes forward and his jaw locked and did not think about the shirt. He thought about the next 12 minutes. He thought about the gate. He thought about the specific angle of the security camera above baggage carousel 3 that his advanced team had already looped with a 6-minute replay of empty corridor footage. He did not think about the shirt. Minsu was strapped to Ryu's chest in a carrier that looked almost comically domestic against the man's 300-pound frame. The baby was asleep, which was the only mercy the universe had offered Ji-Hoon in the last 11 hours, and he watched the small rise and fall of his son's chest with the specific desperation of a man who had exactly one thing left in the world that mattered and knew it. "Gate 72, Ghost said quietly. "We have the block booked. First 3 rows of first class. The crew has been briefed. Captain Han has been compensated." The tail. Black Hyundai dropped off at Terminal 1. "They think you're on the Busan flight." Ji-Hoon nodded once. The block booking had been Ghost's idea, and it was a good one. Buy every seat within visual range. Fill them with your own men. Make the cabin a fortress before the plane even pushes back. It was the kind of operational thinking that had kept the Park Syndicate intact for 30 years under his father, and would keep it intact now that his father was in the ground, and his cousin Lee Sung-jin had decided that blood was thinner than money. What happened in the penthouse on the 43rd floor had been Lee Sung-jin's opening move. What happened at Gate 72 of Incheon International Airport at 11:59 p.m. would be Ji-Hoon's answer. He did not look back as they passed through the private screening channel. He did not look at the faces of the 3 men who peeled away from the terminal's coffee shop and fell into positions 40 meters behind his party with the practiced ease of people who had been following other people for a living since their 20s. He didn't need to look. Ghost had already photographed all 3 of them through the reflection of a newsstand window and sent the images to a contact at the National Police Agency, who owed the Park family a very significant favor from the summer of 2019. By tomorrow morning, those 3 men would have other problems. But tomorrow morning was 14 hours away, and first there was the flight, and first there was Gate 72, and first there was the specific horror that unfolded approximately 40 seconds after Ryu transferred the baby carrier to Ji-Hoon's chest with the careful, almost reverent movements of a man handling something he understood to be irreplaceable. Minsu woke up. He didn't cry at first. He made a sound that Ji-Hoon had come to think of as the warning sound, a kind of wet, preparatory grunt that meant the machinery of infant distress was powering up, and that whatever was coming next would be significant. Ji-Hoon's hands went to the carrier straps out of reflex, not because touching the straps did anything useful, but because it was the only physical response available to him that didn't involve shooting someone. "SHH," he said. His voice came out flat and mechanical, the way it always did when he spoke to the baby, like a man reading instructions in a language he'd only studied briefly in a classroom. "SHH, Minsu. We're almost." Minsu screamed. It was the kind of scream that didn't belong in the quiet carpeted corridors of a private terminal. It was the kind of scream that belonged outdoors, maybe in a field, somewhere with appropriate acoustical space. Several passengers near the gate turned to look. A woman in a Hermes scarf physically flinched. One of Ji-Hoon's own men, a hard-faced operative named Beak, who had once disarmed a man with a kitchen knife using only his forearm, looked at the baby with an expression of pure helpless terror, and then immediately looked away at the middle distance, as if pretending the sound was coming from somewhere else. Ji-Hoon stood very still in the center of Gate 72 with his screaming son strapped to his chest, and his jaw locked, and his eyes forward and thought about the next 12 minutes. He thought about the gate. He did not think about the shirt. The flight to JFK was 14 hours and 20 minutes of progressive psychological deterioration. Minsu cried for the first 40 minutes of the flight while the plane was still climbing, which the flight attendant, a composed young woman named Soo-yeon who had been briefed on Ji-Hoon's identity and was doing an extraordinary job of appearing not to be absolutely terrified, explained might be pressure-related, related to the altitude change, and perhaps the baby needed to nurse or to have something to suck on for the pressure in his ears, which would have been tremendously useful advice if Ji-Hoon had known the first thing about what his son needed. He didn't nurse, he couldn't nurse. He'd been bottle-fed since Ha-yoon died, which was 4 months ago, and Ji-Hoon had not been present for most of those 4 months, because there had been a power vacuum opening in the Seoul underworld with the specific gravitational pull of a dying star, and someone had needed to stand in the center of it and hold the structure together. And that someone had been Ji-Hoon. And while he had been doing that, his son had been in the care of his late wife's mother, a 63-year-old woman named Mrs. Yoon, who was warm and capable and deeply exhausted, and who had handed Minsu to Ji-Hoon at the airport with an expression on her face that was equal parts grief and relief, and something that Ji-Hoon recognized as a very gentle form of accusation. He had not known what to do with that look then. He did not know what to do with his screaming son now. Ryu tried to help. He held the baby for 20 minutes while Ji-Hoon sat rigid in his seat and stared at the seatback in front of him. Minsu screamed through all 20 of those minutes with unwavering commitment. Ghost produced a bottle from the diaper bag. Ji-Hoon hadn't even known there was a diaper bag, and heated it in the galley and brought it back. And Minsu took 4.5 sips and then rejected it with a violence that sent warm formula across Ghost's shirt, and the man absorbed this without comment because he was a professional. By the 3rd hour, the crying had taken on a quality that Ji-Hoon could only describe as biblical. It was no longer the crying of a specific baby with a specific complaint. It had become something larger, an atmospheric event, a feature of the cabin environment, as constant and inescapable as the low roar of the engines. The first-class passengers who were not Ji-Hoon's men had long since retreated behind noise-canceling headphones and the specific 1,000-yard stares of people, pretending very hard to be somewhere else. The woman in seat 3A, Japanese, early 60s, traveling with what appeared to be an assistant, had complained once, quietly, to Soo-yeon in the galley. Soo-yeon had returned with an expression of perfect professional neutrality and delivered a response so diplomatically crafted it conveyed absolutely nothing except the information that she had heard the complaint and that she was very sorry. Seat 3A did not complain again. She had seen the bodyguards. She was not an idiot. By the 4th hour, something had shifted in Ji-Hoon. It wasn't visible on the outside. His face was still the same carved, expressionless surface it always was, the face he'd spent 20 years constructing. But inside, in the part of him that he kept behind all the other parts, something was coming undone. He was holding Minsu against his chest. Ryu had tried the bottle again, and Minsu had again refused. And the baby's face was red and soaked and furious. And Ji-Hoon was looking down at his son and feeling, for the first time in 4 months, the full weight of what he had refused to feel. His wife was dead. His son did not know him. And he was sitting in a pressurized metal tube at 37,000 feet, surrounded by the most capable people he had ever employed, and not a single one of them could tell him what was wrong with his child. His breathing started to change first, short, shallow. He recognized the signs from the one time this had happened before, in a conference room in Busan in the winter of 2021. During a negotiation that had gone sideways and then further sideways, and then so far off the rails that 3 men had ended up in the hospital. He managed it then by excusing himself to the bathroom and standing over the sink for 4 minutes with cold water running over his wrists. He couldn't do that now because he had a 6-month-old strapped to his chest, and he could feel the edges of his vision doing something he didn't like, and the sound of the crying was reaching a frequency that felt less like sound and more like pressure, like something pushing in from all sides. He pressed the heels of his hands against his knees. He stared at a fixed point on the seatback. He breathed. And Maya Johnson, sitting in seat 7C with her 4-year-old daughter Zara asleep across her lap and a cup of now-cold tea in her hand, watched all of this happen from 7 rows back and made a decision that she would spend the next 14 years being unable to fully explain to people who asked her about it. She had been watching the man in first class since boarding. You could not watch him. The bodyguards made that clear. The way the flight attendant moved around him like he was a weather system. The fact that the first 3 rows of first class were occupied entirely by men who had the specific physical density of people who lifted things and broke things for a living. She'd done the math. She was a woman who'd spent 11 years working in pediatric emergency medicine in 3 different countries. And doing that kind of work meant you learned very quickly to read the room, to identify the person in the room who was about to make a situation worse, to spot the thing that everyone else was trying not to see. What she saw was a man in a $4,000 jacket holding a 6-month-old baby with the posture of someone defusing a bomb. What she saw was hands that were slightly too rigid, and a jaw that was slightly too locked, and a stillness that wasn't calm. She knew the difference between calm and controlled panic because she had worked triage, and those were very different presentations. What she saw, 3 hours into the flight, was the baby's face, and what she saw on the baby's face made her put down her tea. She'd seen that face before, not on this baby but on Bobby's. The specific flush-in pull of the jaw, the way the crying had a particular pitch, not the standard infant upset of hunger or discomfort, but the tight, high, saw-edged cry of a baby dealing with pain. Pressure, most likely. The ear canals of infants were arranged differently from adults, shorter and more horizontal, which made them catastrophically susceptible to the kind of pressure changes that happen during altitude shifts. And a 6-month-old on a long-haul flight who hadn't been helped to equalize during ascent could be dealing with pain that felt, to the baby, roughly equivalent to someone slowly pressing a thumb into their eardrum. She knew this. She also knew that the men with the very still, very watchful eyes in the first 3 rows would not respond well to a black woman from economy walking into first class and trying to take the boss's baby. She sat with this knowledge for approximately 90 seconds. Then she unfolded Zara carefully from her lap, settled her daughter across both seats, took her own scarf from around her neck, stood up and walked forward. The bodyguard moved before she'd taken 3 steps into first class. The one on the left, a mountain of a man with a face like a cliff, and he moved with the kind of speed that large men aren't supposed to have, stepping into the aisle and holding up one hand flat in a gesture that was not a question. Maya stopped. She looked at the hand. She looked up at the face attached to it. "His baby is in pain," she said, quiet, clear, the voice she used in triage. "Not crying, pain. I'm a pediatric nurse. Step aside, please." She said this the way she said it in emergency rooms when the family member of a patient was in the way, not unkindly, but with the specific gravity of someone who had done this enough times that the asking of permission had become more courtesy than request. The mountain looked at her. Then he looked past her at the man in the seat. Ji-Hoon had looked up, his eyes very dark, very steady, still doing the thing where they gave away absolutely nothing, were on Maya. She met them directly. She didn't smile and she didn't apologize and she didn't explain herself beyond what she'd already said, because in her experience, the fastest way to get somewhere was to move like you were already supposed to be there. Something shifted in Ji-Hoon's face. It was minimal, barely a millimeter of change around the eyes, but she saw it, the same way she saw things in rooms that other people didn't. He gave the bodyguard the smallest possible nod. The mountain stepped aside. Maya walked to Ji-Hoon's seat, leaned over, and looked at Minsu's face for 4 seconds. Then she straightened up and held out her hands with the matter-of-fact expectation of someone who has reached out for bobbies in distress so many times that the gesture has become pure reflex. "May I?" she said. Ji-Hoon stared at her for a moment that felt, to everyone else in the cabin, significantly longer than it was. Then he handed her his son. She took the baby with both hands, the right under the head, the left under the bottom, the specific geometry of holding an infant that becomes muscle memory after years of practice, and she brought Minsu to her shoulder and began immediately, before she'd even straightened up, applying gentle intermittent pressure to the area just below his left ear with the heel of her thumb. Not massage pressure. Specific, careful. The kind of pressure that required knowing exactly where the eustachian tube ran in a 6-month-old, and what angle of force could help it drain. Minsu kept crying for another 43 seconds. Then, with the specific suddenness of a storm ending, he stopped. Not into sleep. His eyes were open, and they were Ji-Hoon's eyes, that same dark watchfulness, looking up at Maya's face with the radical openness of an infant whose entire existence is a process of taking in information about the world. He made a small sound that was not crying. He blinked. The cabin was so quiet that Maya could hear the ice settling in someone's drink 3 rows back. She turned to look at Ji-Hoon. He was staring at his son with an expression that had bypassed the face he wore for strangers and arrived at something much further underneath. She had seen that expression too. Not on gangsters and crime lords. She didn't know that's what he was. Not yet, but on parents, in corridors outside of operating rooms, in the moment when the doctor came out to tell them that the thing they couldn't survive losing was, in fact, going to be fine. "His ears," she said. "The pressure changed during ascent. 6-month-olds can't equalize themselves the way older kids can. He's been dealing with the equivalent of significant ear pain for at least 3 hours." Ji-Hoon's jaw moved slightly. He was fine on the ground-level. Pressure is different. The cabin pressurizes to the equivalent of 8,000 feet roughly. Adults barely notice. Infants without the muscle coordination to yawn or swallow on command. She stopped, recalibrated. He needed help, that's all. Ji-Hoon looked at her for a long moment. "You walked past 4 men to help a stranger's child." "I walked past 4 men to help a child who was in pain," Maya said. "The stranger part is incidental." She handed Minsu back slowly, making sure Ji-Hoon's hands were in the right positions before she released the weight. She felt Ji-Hoon's fingers adjust as she let go, instinctive this time, not careful and mechanical the way they'd been when she'd watched him hold the baby from 7 rows back. His body knew something his mind hadn't caught up to yet. She was about to return to her seat. "Sit down," Ji-Hoon said. It was not a question, and it was not particularly gentle, and the bodyguards straightened slightly in their seats, and Maya looked at the man and assessed the situation with the speed of someone who had spent a lot of years assessing situations quickly. She sat down. Soo-yeon appeared beside them within 20 seconds with the practiced telepathy of an excellent flight attendant, and Maya asked for hot water and received it, and she asked Ji-Hoon if there was formula, and he looked at Ghost, who produced the diaper bag with an expression of contained relief that the proceedings had taken a turn toward something manageable. For the next 20 minutes, Maya showed Ji-Hoon how to hold the bottle at the angle that prevented Minsu from swallowing air, how to check the temperature against the inside of the wrist, not the back of the hand, how to read the cues, the rooting reflex, the tongue thrust, the way the baby's hands opened and closed when he was hungry versus when he was overstimulated. She spoke in the same level, clinical tone she used with the families of her patients, and Ji-Hoon listened with an attention that she would not have predicted from the outside of him, and that made more sense the more she watched his face. He was taking notes, not literally, but in the way that people who were used to acquiring operational information took notes, absorbing, categorizing, committing to a kind of internal record. "You haven't done this much," she said. "Not accusation, observation." "No." "How long has his mother?" She caught herself. "4 months," Ji-Hoon said. "She died 4 months ago." Maya was quiet for a moment. The specific silence of someone who works in medicine and has learned that there are some kinds of information that need a moment of actual space before the conversation can continue. "I'm sorry," she said, and she meant it in the plain, direct way that people who have sat with real grief mean it, not as a social obligation. Ji-Hoon nodded once. He was looking at Minsu, who was feeding now, both tiny hands gripping the bottle with an urgency that was deeply endearing and slightly comic. Something in Ji-Hoon's shoulders had moved, infinitesimal, but it had moved. Some architecture of tension had rearranged. "He has her eyes," Ji-Hoon said. He said it the way people say things they've been holding so long that when they finally release them they're almost surprised by the weight. "Ha-Yoon, my wife, she had this way of—" He stopped. His jaw locked again. Maya waited. "She had this way of looking at things," he said finally, like she was memorizing them, like she knew they wouldn't last. The plane moved through the dark above the Pacific with the low, sustained engine note that is the closest thing to silence that exists at 37,000 feet. Maya thought about this, about the specific grief of a person who loved someone with the habit of memory, and then found themselves in a world where the memorization had stopped. "What's his name?" she asked. "Minsu." "Minsu," she said it the right way, which meant she had heard the phonetics correctly on the first attempt. "He's beautiful." Ji-Hoon looked at her, really looked, the way he had not looked at anyone in months, and said nothing for a moment. Then, "You have a child." "My daughter, Zara, she's 4, asleep back there hopefully." Maya glanced behind her. "She can sleep anywhere, she gets that from her father." "And her father is not in the picture, which is fine, we're fine." She said this with the slight extra weight that people put on words they've said enough times that they've had to decide whether they still believe them. "We're going home. I've been working in Lagos for 8 months. UNICEF Pediatric program. I'm ready to sleep in my own bed." Ji-Hoon considered this. Nigeria. 14 months, before that Bangladesh, before that 3 years in London. She shrugged. "I go where the need is." "Why?" The question was plain and direct, and she appreciated the absence of the usual performative admiration that people offered when they heard what she did for work. "That's so amazing, and you're such an angel," that always made her feel like they were handling something they found incomprehensible by reducing it to a simple moral category. "Because I'm good at it," she said. "And because a child in pain in Lagos matters the same as a child in pain in London, and I can't pretend otherwise and do this job." Ji-Hoon was quiet. He looked down at Minsu again. The baby had finished most of the bottle and was in that specific infant state of satisfied semi-alertness, looking at the overhead, lighting with the deep philosophical focus of someone encountering artificial light for the first time. "You're not afraid of me," Ji-Hoon said. He said it as an observation, with a thread of what might have been curiosity in it. Maya tilted her head slightly. "Should I be?" "Most people are." "I work in pediatric emergencies. The most frightening things I've seen were not frightening because of who was in the room. They were frightening because of what was happening to the child. You're the father. You're scared." She held his eyes. "That's very visible, by the way. I don't know if anyone told you that." Something moved across Ji-Hoon's face that she would have called, in a clinical context, emotional impact. The specific micro-expression of someone who has received information that landed somewhere real. "No," he said, "no one has told me that." She reached into the diaper bag and produced the muslin square she'd noticed near the top, plain white, clearly new, unused, the way everything in the diaper bag was clearly new and unused, a set assembled by someone who had researched what should be in a diaper bag without knowing why any of it was there. She held it up. "Can I borrow this?" He nodded. She took the muslin and her own scarf, wide, soft, batik-patterned in deep terracotta and gold, and she began to tie them together with the focused competence of someone who has done this before, a configuration that she explained as she worked. "This is a wrapping technique. West African, there are different versions across the continent. This particular method comes from what I've learned from Yoruba mothers in Lagos. The principle is," she was tying as she spoke, her hands moving with the specific efficiency of practiced motion, "that skin-to-skin contact between a parent and an infant regulates both of their nervous systems. The baby's heart rate synchronizes with the parent's. The cortisol levels drop, both of them." She looked at him. "Both of them. You look like you need your cortisol levels to drop." Ji-Hoon said nothing. He allowed her to adjust the wrapping across his chest, to position Minsu against him in a way that brought the baby's chest to rest against his own, the baby's ear over his heart. She tied the ends in a configuration that distributed the weight evenly across both shoulders and the lower back. It looked, she was aware, like a man in a $4,000 jacket wearing a baby in a terracotta and gold scarf, which was an image she thought she would keep. Minsu settled into it immediately. The small body relaxed with the totality that only infants achieve, absolute, instantaneous, complete. His hands opened. His head turned slightly so that his ear was pressed directly over his father's heartbeat. Ji-Hoon sat very still. "He can feel your heartbeat," Maya said. "It's the first sound he ever heard before his own. Your wife's heart, yours, it's home for him, it still is." Ji-Hoon stared straight ahead. His face was doing something that was clearly costing him significant effort to control. Maya looked away to give him the moment, picked up her tea, found it cold and set it down again. "My mother," she said, in the specific quiet voice she used when she wanted to give someone else's silence some company without interrupting it, used to say that the most dangerous thing you could do to a man who had hardened himself was to hand him a baby, because the baby doesn't know who he is, doesn't care. Bobbies don't read the room. Ji-Hoon made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but was in that neighborhood. "She was right," he said. They talked for 6 hours. Later, when Maya tried to reconstruct it, and she tried many times in the years that followed, in the particular way you reconstruct things that changed you, she couldn't account for how it happened, the gradual removal of the distance between them. It wasn't one moment. It was a series of small surrenders, on both sides, the way a tide comes in, not with drama but with persistence, each small wave reaching slightly further than the last. He asked about her work. The real work, not the version she gave at dinner parties, the specifics, the cases, the particular texture of what it meant to do emergency pediatrics in under-resourced environments with intermittent electricity and equipment that was a decade out of date. She gave him the real version because something about the quality of his attention made the performance version feel like an insult. She asked about him. She asked carefully, leaving space, not pressing. The way you approach something wounded, you move sideways, you don't go straight at it. She didn't ask what he did or who he was. She asked about Minsu, about Ha-yoon, about what Ha-yoon had been like. He told her. He spoke about his wife with the careful, deliberate manner of someone who had not spoken about her aloud to anyone in 4 months, because there had been no one to speak to. The people around him were employees, and employees did not ask, and the men who were not employees were people he was currently trying to outmaneuver, and grief, in his world, was a liability he could not afford to display. Ha-yoon had been a photographer. She had photographed the places that were disappearing, ice fields, coastlines, forests at their margins. She had been in Indonesia on a project when the blood clot happened. It was so fast that there was almost nothing to call it. She was there, and then she was not. And Ji-Hoon had been in a car somewhere in Seoul dealing with the Lee Sung-jin situation, and his phone had rung and the world had done the thing that worlds do when the worst possible news arrives, which was to simply continue. Everything continued. The car moved. The city went about its business. Ji-Hoon sat in the back of the car and received the information and sat with it for a moment and then continued. Because there was no other option. Because the Lee Sung-jin situation was the kind of situation that did not pause for personal grief. Because the structure of the life he had built, the hierarchy, the obligations, the lethal consequences of appearing weak at the precise wrong moment, did not accommodate what he was actually feeling, which was a tearing sensation in the center of his chest that had not stopped for 4 months. Maya listened to all of this. She did not offer him anything except her attention, which in her experience was usually what people needed and almost never what they were offered. She did not tell him it would get easier or that Ha-yoon was in a better place or that time was the healer of wounds. She listened and she was quiet, and when he stopped she let the silence be. My father left when I was 7, she said eventually. My mother raised me and my 2 brothers on a nursing salary, in Hackney, which is not the most forgiving place to do that. She looked at Minsu, who was still perfectly asleep against Ji-Hoon's chest, his small face slack with the total trust of a sleeping baby. She never complained, and she never stopped. She just kept moving, and I used to think when I was little that she was made of something different than other people. Something harder. And now I know she was terrified every single day and she kept moving anyway. She just never thought her fear was more important than what needed to be done. She paused. Turns out that's not a special material. That's just parenting. Ji-Hoon looked down at his son. I don't know how to do this, he said. It came out quieter than the other things, less shaped, the specific texture of an admission that had been waiting behind a very strong door for a long time. I know how to run operations. I know how to read a room. I know how to, he stopped. I don't know how to be his father. I don't know what he needs. I didn't know he was in pain. I've been sitting next to him for 4 hours and I didn't know. You knew enough to hand him to someone who could help him, Maya said. Which, by the way, took more courage than I think you're giving yourself credit for. He looked at her. You handed your child to a stranger, she said. A woman you never met, who walked past your security, who you had every practical reason to distrust. You handed him to me because you could see he needed help that you couldn't give him. She held his eyes. That's not failure. That's love with enough self-awareness to know its own limits. That is very literally the definition of good parenting. Ji-Hoon was quiet for a long moment. You're unusual, he said finally. I've been told. That's not, he paused, with the slight uncertainty of someone recalibrating their register. I mean it as something I don't have a word for. The turbulence hit at hour 7 like a verdict. It was not, in the scheme of turbulence events over the Pacific, extraordinary. The seatbelt sign illuminated. The pilot came on with the flat, reassuring cadence of someone who had been through significantly worse, and was paid specifically to convey that this was manageable. Soo-yeon moved through the cabin with the specific efficiency of a person who had done her emergency training and retained it. Maya gripped her armrest. She was not afraid of flying, but she had Zara to think about, 7 rows back, and the lurching drop of an air pocket at altitude activated something very primal and very non-negotiable in her nervous system. Ji-Hoon's hand closed over hers on the armrest. Not romantically, practically, the way you anchor something. His hand was completely steady. Maya looked down at it and then up at him, and he was sitting with exactly the same posture as before, Minsu still wrapped against his chest, looking forward with the calm of a man for whom physical danger had become such a constant feature of life that turbulence at 37,000 feet ranked very low on his threat assessment. Breathe, he said. She almost laughed. I was about to say the same to you 4 hours ago. You did. Did it work? He looked down at Minsu, asleep on his chest, and then back at her. Yes. The turbulence passed in 6 minutes. Soo-yeon reappeared with mineral water. Ji-Hoon released Maya's hand without comment. Maya straightened in her seat and did the breath she told her patients, parents to do, 4 counts in, hold 4, 4 out, and was in the middle of it when she heard Ji-Hoon's phone produce a sound. Not a ring. A single short tone, the kind associated with a specific type of message, and the change in the cabin was immediate, and she felt it before she understood it. The bodyguard straightening, Ghost materializing from somewhere aft with his eyes already narrowed. The specific recalibration of the room's energy from something that had been cautiously, unexpectedly human to something operational. Ji-Hoon read the screen for 4 seconds. When he looked up, the face was back. Not the face she'd been sitting next to for 6 hours, the other one, the carved one, the one that gave away nothing and was clearly designed to give away nothing because what was behind it right now could not be visible. But Maya was looking at the right place. The hand holding the phone was completely still, but the tendons at the wrist were doing something they hadn't been doing before. Ghost bent and said something very quietly in Korean that Maya did not understand. Ji-Hoon replied with 3 words. Ghost straightened and went immediately to the front of the cabin, where he spoke briefly and very quietly to Ryu, and Ryu went to the galley and the galley curtain closed. Ji-Hoon looked at Minsu. The baby was still asleep, still breathing with the total relaxed rhythm of an infant who has had his needs met and is processing the world at the cellular level. His small hands were curled loosely against his chest. He looked, Maya thought, like proof that something was right in the universe, which was a thought she understood was not relevant to whatever had just shifted in the room, but which she was having anyway. "Is everything okay?" she asked, already knowing the answer was no. Ji-Hoon looked at her with an assessment that she now recognized as the specific look of someone who was deciding how much truth was appropriate for the current situation. She held his gaze and waited. "The people who want to hurt me," he said quietly, "know which flight I'm on." She processed this. "How many people want to hurt you?" "Enough. And at JFK. There will be people waiting." He paused. "Not law enforcement, the other kind." Maya sat with this for a moment. Outside the window, the first gray intimation of dawn was beginning at the edge of the Pacific horizon, and somewhere below them was a very large, very cold ocean, and somewhere ahead was New York, and Maya thought about Zara asleep 7 rows back and the specific weight of what she was hearing. "Are we in danger?" she asked. "On the plane?" "No, the risk is on the ground." He paused, and she could see him working towards something, the specific forward-leaning of a person who is about to say something they have not said before. "The risk on the ground is specifically for me, and for anyone in my company." "Meaning your men?" "Meaning my men and Minsu." Maya looked at the baby. She looked at Ji-Hoon. She understood what was coming before he said it, with the intuitive speed of someone who has spent years in rooms where the next terrible thing is always visible slightly before it arrives, and she felt it in her body, a tightening in the chest, a settling of weight, the specific physical sensation of being at the edge of something that, once crossed, cannot be uncrossed. "What do you need?" she asked. Her voice was completely steady. Ji-Hoon met her eyes. "I need you to understand that I have no right to ask what I'm about to ask. I need you to understand that I know this. I need you to understand." Something crossed his face, real and unguarded, the face under all the other faces. "He is all I have left of her, if something happens to him." "What do you need?" she said again. "Take him through customs," Ji-Hoon said, "as your son." The silence that followed was the longest silence of the conversation. Maya sat with the words. She understood them completely, and she needed the moment not for comprehension but for the specific reckoning of what saying yes would mean. She was a pediatric nurse. She was a single mother traveling internationally with documentation for 1 child. She was sitting on a plane in international airspace being asked by a man she had known for 6 hours. A man whose occupation she still only understood in the impressionistic way one understood things when all the specific details were deliberately withheld. To pass his infant son through United States customs as her own child. She thought about Zara. She thought about her nursing license. She thought about the mortgage on the flat in Peckham that had 11 years left on it. She thought about her mother, who had raised her to know exactly what she was worth and to not spend it carelessly. She thought about Minsu's face, 6 hours ago, before she had walked forward, the red, pain-soaked face of a child whose father didn't know how to help him. She thought about Ji-Hoon saying, "He is all I have left of her." She thought about Ha-Yoon, who had photographed the things that were disappearing, who had her son's eyes. "If they see you," she said carefully, "if they're already at the airport, they'll see your men too. My men will draw their attention in the terminal. That's their job. And you? I'll draw more of it in the parking structure. I'll come through separately." Maya absorbed this. "You're going to use yourself as the distraction." Ji-Hoon said nothing, which was an answer. She stopped. "That's an enormous personal risk." "It's my son." She looked at him. He looked back at her with an evenness that she had by now learned to read, the stillness that was not absence of feeling but the specific management of feeling by a person who had decided, at some foundational level, that feelings were something you organized rather than expressed. Except that right now, underneath the management, she could see it. The father, the man who had sat on a 14-hour flight and learned how to hold a bottle, learned how to feel a heartbeat synchronize, learned, in the specific wordless language of skin-to-skin contact, what it meant to be someone's home. "Zara's stroller," Maya said slowly. "It has a bassinet attachment that faces away from the pusher. Minsu would be hidden in it until we were past the main scanning area." She was thinking aloud now, the same focused operational thinking she applied to triage scenarios. His paperwork. "Ghost has a document for him, a clean one." Ji-Hoon said this carefully, watching her face. She raised an eyebrow at that. "Of course he does. It's close enough to Zara's details. If anyone looks closely." "If anyone looks closely, we have a problem," she said. "So let's make sure no one looks closely." She took a breath. "How far through the terminal before I'm clear?" "If you reach the ground-level exit, you're out of their zone of control. It's the customs hall and the first 200 meters of the arrivals terminal that are compromised. And then there's a car." He said this with the directness of someone who has planned this in the last 20 minutes with the kind of focused efficiency that is only possible for people who have been planning contingencies their whole lives. "It will take you to wherever you need to go. You will not see me until we're out." Until I'm out," he said. "I will be out." She looked at him for a long moment. "I'm doing this for him," she said, looking at Minsu. "I want to be clear about that." "I know," Ji-Hoon said, and then in a different tone, slightly rougher, less managed. "I know that." JFK at 6:40 in the morning had the specific quality of an airport that hasn't quite decided whether it's done being the night before. The arrivals hall was lit with the slightly exhausted brightness of fluorescent light, in a space that sees too much of human life at its most undefended, tired, rumpled, disoriented. And Maya moved through it with the focused purpose of a woman who had navigated international arrivals in Lagos and Dhaka and Heathrow, and knew that the secret was to move like you belonged there, and to never, under any circumstances, look for the thing you were afraid of. Zara was awake and cooperative, which was its own small miracle. Maya had explained it to her daughter in the careful, child-accessible way she explained difficult things. "There's a baby who needs our help getting through the airport. We're going to push him in your stroller. It's important that we walk normally." And Zara, who had her mother's particular quality of taking in information and organizing it without unnecessary drama, had nodded with the gravity of a 4-year-old who understood that something important was happening. Minsu was in the stroller bassinet, facing up, awake and looking at the arrivals hall ceiling with his characteristic philosophical focus. He had not cried since the plane. He was dressed in a spare outfit that had been in the diaper bag, plain white, mercifully neutral, and he looked, Maya thought, entirely himself and entirely separate from any story she might tell about him, which was both the challenge and the gift. Ghost had materialized beside her at the gate, before they'd separated from Ji-Hoon's group. A brief, wordless exchange in which he produced a document wallet and placed it in the stroller's undercarriage compartment with the precision of someone who had done this kind of thing many times in many different airports, and met her eyes just once, with a look that communicated, with remarkable efficiency, both the weight of what was being asked and his sincere belief that she could do it. She had nodded once, he had walked away. Ji-Hoon had not come to her. He had looked at her from across the gate area, 20 meters of airport carpet between them, and he had looked at Minsu in the stroller and then back at her, and she had held his eyes for a moment and then turned and walked toward customs. The customs hall was the part she didn't think about too hard, because thinking about it too hard would activate something in her face that she needed not to be activated. She had spent 11 years mastering the calm face, the face you give to a terrified parent in an emergency, the face that says everything is being handled, the face that is true and false simultaneously because the truth is that everything is being handled and also that the situation is serious, and the two things are not mutually exclusive. And she deployed it now like the professional asset it was. The customs officer was a man in his 50s who looked like he had been doing this job for a very long time and found it neither interesting nor uninteresting, which was exactly the right thing for him to be. She handed him her passport and Zara's documentation, which she had prepared during the descent, laid on top, accessible, her hands not shaking, her face pleasant and open. Length of stay outside the U.S. 8 months. Purpose of travel. Medical work, UNICEF program. He looked at the documentation. He looked at Zara, who was holding Maya's hand and looking at the customs officer with the unsettling directness that 4-year-olds sometimes deployed on adults. He glanced at the stroller. The bassinet was angled away from him. Both children traveling with you. The pause before Maya answered was less than 1 second. Yes, she said. He stamped the passports. He handed them back. He said, "Welcome home," with the flat civility of someone who has said that phrase approximately 40,000 times and means it in a purely technical sense. Maya said, "Thank you," and moved through. She did not exhale. She had learned long ago that exhaling too soon was how you announced that something had been difficult, and she was not going to announce that. She pushed the stroller through the arrivals hall with Zara trotting beside her and the specific, focused, forward-moving energy of a woman who was almost somewhere safe. She was 30 meters from the ground-level exit when she felt it. Not saw it, felt it. The way you feel a room change before you've processed why. 2 men near the exit, to the left of the sliding doors, wearing the kind of ordinary man clothes that men who did not want to be noticed wore when they were trying not to be noticed, and they were looking at the arrival stream with the particular quality of attention that was not quite how civilians looked at arrival streams. It was a quality she recognized from the plane, the specific stillness of men who were waiting for something specific. One of them had a phone in his hand, and he was holding it at a slight angle that suggested he was taking photographs of the people coming through. Maya did not change her pace. She did not look at them. She looked at the exit and she put one foot in front of the other and she thought, with the specific clarity that crisis can produce, about what would happen next. What happened next was that a car alarm went off somewhere in the parking structure, sharp and sudden and loud. And then 3 more went off in rapid succession. And then there was a sound that Maya's body recognized before her brain did, not gunfire, but close enough that her nervous system filed it in the same category. And then one of the 2 men near the exit moved very fast away from the door in the direction of the parking structure, speaking urgently into something. And the second one moved half a step to follow. In the gap they left, Maya pushed the stroller through the exit door and into the gray, cold, early morning light of New York. A black car was waiting exactly where Ji-Hoon had said a black car would be waiting. The driver was a woman, mid-30s, watching the exit, who met Maya's eyes and got out of the car with the immediate, organized movement of someone who had been fully briefed. She opened the rear door. She took the stroller. She was already folding it with practiced speed before Maya had finished getting Zara into the backseat. Minsu was on Maya's lap, in the car in the early morning light, looking up at her face with those eyes. She sat with him for the 45 seconds it took the driver to stow the stroller and get back in the car and get them moving. She sat with him, and she breathed, and she let herself feel the specific cocktail of terror and relief, and something else she didn't have a clean name for, something that was in the territory of love but was more structural than love. The way the bones of a building are in the territory of beauty but are more load-bearing. She had carried this baby through an airport. She would have done it again. The driver took them 3 blocks and pulled into a parking structure. On the second level, there was another black car, and next to it, standing with the posture of a man who has just been through something significant and is not going to perform the extent of it, was Ji-Hoon. He was bleeding slightly above the left eyebrow. Not badly, a cut, the kind that looks worse than it is. His jacket was different. She didn't know when he'd changed it, but it was, and she filed this detail away as evidence that he was operational in some very complete, very practiced way that she was only seeing the surface of. He had 2 men with him, both intact, both watchful. Maya got out of the car with Minsu. Ji-Hoon crossed the distance between them in 5 steps. He stopped in front of her and he looked at his son, and something in his face did the thing she had been watching it do all night, the managed thing failing, the real thing arriving, unstoppable. Minsu looked back at his father with the expression of a 6-month-old encountering the face that, above all other faces in the world, belonged to him. He made a sound. Not crying, the opposite of crying. A sound that Maya had heard many times before in her work, in moments after things had been resolved, the sound of recognition, of relief expressed in the only register a 6-month-old has access to. He made the sound and his hands opened and reached, in the helpless, total way that Bobbies reach for the thing they want. He reached for Ji-Hoon. Maya transferred him carefully, both hands supporting, feeling Ji-Hoon's arms close around his son, with the sureness they had not had at the beginning of the night. The certainty of a man who had, in the last 14 hours, begun to learn the weight and the warmth and the specific gravity of being someone's father. Ji-Hoon held Minsu against his chest. He pressed his mouth briefly to the top of the baby's head. He stayed like that for a moment that was purely private, regardless of who was watching, because he had stopped managing it. When he looked up, his eyes were dry, just barely, and they were Ji-Hoon's eyes, which was to say that whatever was behind them was immense and would not be narrated. "Thank you," he said. 2 words almost inaudible in the specific register of something said by a person who means it more than language is equipped to carry. Maya looked at him for a moment. At this man she had met at 37,000 feet above the Pacific, who had been carrying every kind of weight there was, grief and power and responsibility and terror and love, and who had, in the span of 14 hours and a crying baby and a terracotta gold scarf, become someone she understood. "Don't waste it," she said. "Whatever comes next, don't waste the chance to know him." Ji-Hoon nodded, once. He looked at Ghost. Ghost stepped forward with an envelope and held it out to Maya. She looked at it and then at Ji-Hoon. "I don't want," she started. "It's not money," Ji-Hoon said. "Open it." She opened it. Inside was a card with a single number on it and 2 lines of text in English. She read it twice. She looked up. "Your mortgage is already handled," Ji-Hoon said. "The account has been settled. The second line is for Zara's education, from primary through university, wherever she chooses. Consider it," he paused, and something in his expression was almost wry, almost the face of someone who has found, in the middle of everything, a small thread of something that functions like lightness, consideration for services rendered. Maya was quiet for a moment. "You didn't have to do this," she said. I wanted to, Ji-Hoon said, and this was very clearly the true version, the version with no performance in it. It's the only thing I can give you that equals what you gave him. She looked at the card again. She thought about the mortgage, which was 11 years of weight she'd been carrying with both hands. She thought about Zara's education, which she had calculated and recalculated and worried about in the quiet hours of many nights in many countries. She put the card in her pocket. Take care of him, she said, not the baby. She looked at Ji-Hoon. Take care of yourself, he needs you, not your empire, not your operation, you. Ji-Hoon absorbed this with the same quality of attention he'd given everything she'd said. And she believed, in the way she believed things that had no concrete evidence but had the weight of genuine human observation behind them, that he heard it. She went back to the car, where Zara was watching everything from the backseat with the focused stillness of a child who knows she is in the middle of something important and is storing all of it. Is the baby okay? Zara asked. The baby is okay, Maya said. Is the man okay? Maya buckled her seatbelt. Through the parking structure window, she could see Ji-Hoon standing with Minsu against his chest, looking after the car. The morning light was gray and level, and it fell on them both without preference, on the man and the child, on the power and the grief and the beginning of something. He's going to be, Maya said. The car moved. In the parking structure, Ji-Hoon stood with his son and watched the car go. He watched until the taillights disappeared around the ramp, and then he stood for another moment in the particular quiet that follows the departure of something that mattered. Minsu, pressed against his father's chest, had closed his eyes. He was asleep. Ji-Hoon looked down at the small, sleeping face and felt the weight of everything, the flight, the night, the threat neutralized and the threat still out there, the long architecture of consequence that stretched ahead of him in every direction. He felt all of it, and he did not manage it or organize it or put it behind the face he wore for the world. He stood in the gray morning in a parking garage in New York, and he held his son and he breathed. And across the city, in the back of a car moving toward Peckham by way of memory and a 14-hour flight and one improbable, irreversible choice, Maya Johnson pressed her fingers against the card in her pocket and thought about the particular mathematics of trust, what it costs, what it returns, the specific calculation of a moment when two strangers at the end of their separate ropes had reached, across all the distance of their different lives, and held each other up. She thought about the terracotta scarf, which was somewhere on the plane or in the gate or lost in the machinery of the morning, and she thought that she didn't mind. Some things were worth spending. She thought about what she would tell Zara someday, when Zara was old enough for the full version. She thought she would tell her the truth, that the most unthinkable act in the world is not breaking the rules. It's trusting someone enough to let them help you carry the thing you've been carrying alone. And Zara, she suspected, would nod with the solemnity of someone who already understood this, the way she had understood at 4 years old. In the backseat of a car in a parking structure in New York, that the baby was okay and the man was going to be. Children always knew. That was the thing about them. They always knew. If this story stayed with you, if you felt something in that parking garage, in that customs line, in that moment when a baby reached for his father, then you already understand what this was really about. It was never about the mafia. It was about what we carry and who we let help us carry it. Subscribe if you want more stories that find the human thing inside the unthinkable situation. And drop a comment below. Tell me, was Maya brave or reckless? Was Ji-Hoon's gift enough? There's no wrong answer. Leave it below, and if you know someone who needed to hear this story today, share it with them. That's all. See you in the next one.